All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're going back to 1992 to have another look at the Ruby Ridge Massacre in Boundary County, Idaho. We've mentioned this before on the channel, but to kind of get back into this one, it's tied to something that we were having a discussion about recently, the Illuminati of all things. And no, I don't personally believe that the Illuminati was behind Ruby Ridge, but we had a couple lines in that entire episode about how government is something that is not to be trusted. And like the exact YouTuber I was quoting said something to the effect of, government is a scary thing. I believe that's the exact adjective. And I started to think about that in the context of Ruby Ridge, because somebody had been posting about Ruby Ridge on Twitter, and then, I just kind of connected the two dots together. Government is something that is not to be trusted, and that things can get out of hand. And yes, of course, we have things like the system of checks and balances, but what about for the individuals? What about for the ordinary citizens like you and me? So that's how we're getting back to Ruby Ridge. Now, once again, this is going to be geared towards some people who are probably kind of familiar with a lot of the background information on Ruby Ridge, and perhaps I'll post a link to the first upload that we did that covers more of that stuff. The heart and soul of this particular issue is that an individual named Randy Weaver moved from Iowa to northern Idaho, Boundary County, on the border of Canada, hence the name, all the way at the top of the chimney, and he was caught up in kind of a tricky situation. He was attending a meeting of the Aryan Nation, although his daughter, Sarah, tried to argue that he was never a member of the Aryan Nation, he just attended a meeting. And while he was there, he met an undercover informant for the government, a federal agent who was undercover, who posed as an arms dealer and asked Randy Weaver if he could produce a sawed-off shotgun for him. And Randy Weaver was not someone who did that normally, but he agreed to do it. I mean, he didn't go out trying to seek this thing. That's what I mean when I say he didn't do it normally. He didn't go out looking for customers or anything. The informant asked him to do it and kind of coaxed him into the situation. Thus, I mean, the rest. That's why we had the whole Ruby Ridge massacre, because they're just like, now they've tried to say they've caught him doing something illegal and they're trying to get him arrested, and then he's just like, hey, this is a ridiculous situation, so he holds up in his house at Ruby Ridge, and that led to an 11-day standoff and a bunch of chaos. And Randy Weaver's son, I almost said Sarah Weaver, the daughter, Randy Weaver's son, Sam, was murdered. I mean, he was shot in part of the massacre. Not to mention that another U.S. Marshal was also shot and killed. So you had deaths on both sides, casualties and fatalities on both sides. I know that's the absolute biggest nutshell version thing that you could hear about Ruby Ridge, but the things that we're going to discuss here are kind of just the issues around it. And I would say, though, no matter what anyone says about Randy Weaver, if you do some digging and you read some articles about him, you might find some things that are unflattering. You might find that he did some things prior to 1992 that were not so admirable. And, he even attended a meeting of the Aryan Nation, which I don't necessarily think is the most admirable thing in the world. But all that aside, we're supposed to have the laws and the rights for everybody, and not only just people that we agree with all the time. So that's kind of one of the ways we have to approach this. And you definitely see, though, that this is perhaps a major case where the government went too far, and it's the exact stuff that we had just mentioned. Who is there to watch over the government? Who is there to watch over people who are just trying to use their power and their authority to come down on another person? And once again, though, it was someone who was working for the federal government that kind of coaxed him into the situation and then said, look at what he's done. That probably wouldn't have happened otherwise if that federal agent hadn't tried to coax him into that particular thing. But this is not an isolated incident. It's not an isolated incident of the government trying to pull somebody into a trap. Absolutely not. And this, by definition, can't be, because who was involved with the standoff at Ruby Ridge? The U.S. Marshals, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives. It's like all of these agencies have an issue in it with Ruby Ridge. All of them have a stake in it. They all have some skin in the game. And yes, the actual standoff was mostly dealing with the marshals and the FBI. But the thing is that all of these government agencies could just kind of come together in this place in northern Idaho. So it means that this is a very, very kind of nasty system. It's like some people have power and authority, and when they abuse that power and authority, they have a whole lot of support that can come down on this stuff. And it goes to say, it goes without saying though, if we have at least four agencies that we've cited: Department of Justice, FBI, ATF, and the U.S. Marshals. This cannot be an isolated incident because all of them are kind of doing these things simultaneously, and it's going to happen all around the country. The reason why there was such outrage about this particular case is just they're like, it just sort of seems like they're just kind of coercing somebody into committing an illegal action, and then they're just trying to kind of pin that on somebody, which it's sort of the fault of the government. And it's the whole juvenalian satire: who is there to guard the guards themselves? Who is really watching how these things do not blow out of control? Once again, Randy Weaver might not have been the most flattering person in the world, but at the same time, he didn't really necessarily deserve to have his son killed in this standoff because of a firearms charge that was kind of, or he was blatantly deceived by a government agent into doing something he probably wouldn't have done otherwise. And it's like they were kind of trying to stand up to injustice. And on that note, one of the things that I hear almost never talked about with Ruby Ridge is that when you look at some of the videography of this, like in the documentary films, like there's the Discovery Times channel put out a piece on Ruby Ridge, and you can like see some of the stuff there. But in any of the films, if you look at the protesters who came to this area in northern Idaho, you see signs from all different sides of politics. You see left-wing signs and right-wing signs. This isn't only something that was supported by like passionate right-wing things. When you hear something about the Aryan Nation, you're probably going to associate immediately that it must be just one sort of group of people. No, you see world peace activists. You just see people who are trying to stand up to injustice. They don't talk about this in the films, but if you look at the videography, you can see just stuff like Peace Now and things like that. And I mean, a lot of people are just recognizing that perhaps this was a nasty situation that could have been dealt with better by the federal agents involved, by the U.S. Marshals, and by the FBI. They could have handled this situation in a better way, but why didn't they do it in a better way? Why did it lead to this nasty standoff? Well, the reason is because people who have power like to exercise their power. People who have power really tend to get nasty, controlling, and even for the sole sake of not wanting to back down. And why would the people in government be immune to any of these problems? That's the biggest thing that we're dealing with here. And that's the kind of theme of this entire upload. It's like, if the ordinary person can do something wrong, why can't the ordinary people that are in our government? This is the United States of America. We do not live in a monarchy. We don't have an aristocracy. There's no such thing as royal blood. There's no such thing how somebody is kind of more valuable than another person by bloodline. We're all people and we're all flawed. You ever heard the expression that nobody's perfect? So that includes the people who are in government. And that includes administration. And that includes things like the FBI and the ATF and the U.S. Marshals and the Department of Justice. And sometimes they can go to very extreme measures that are horribly destructive for the average individual. And it's like, maybe you won't always have a shootout like you had at Ruby Ridge. Maybe it won't always be done in this exact same way, but people are getting skewered by our broken systems. Broken systems are not immune to the United States of America, or we should say that, maybe I got my words a little jumbled. The United States of America is not immune to having broken systems. That's perhaps the way that we should do it. And Ruby Ridge was a classic example of that. Granted, though, after Ruby Ridge, of course, I was watching True Crime Daily earlier today, and they have the interview with the daughter of Randy Weaver, Sarah Weaver, and she is just talking about sharing a lot of the things. It's a great interview, actually. It's kind of it's kind of saddening to watch because she's describing the death of her brother. But at the end of that one, of course, they're talking about how there were reforms made to the code of conduct after Ruby Ridge, and that's kind of the stuff that's perhaps you're familiar with that if you've seen anything about this incident. I mean, that's a step in the right direction, but that is not a cure-all. Just because they're kind of changing a few lines in the codes of conduct, that is not a massive cure-all. And I mean, it doesn't really deal with the power dynamic. And perhaps some people, like the Weavers, were probably trying to get away from some of that by moving to northern Idaho. I mean, there is some other stuff that the wife of Randy Weaver was kind of involved with some sort of religious premonitions. But once again, I don't want to criticize anything about the family, about why they did what they did, because it's almost just like it feels irrelevant to me at the point why they moved to Idaho and why they were doing certain things and any of their actions prior to 1992, because we have to look at the fact right now. What they did prior to that did not justify the government's use of lethal force, the government's abuse of power, and the government's manipulation of a broken system. It's not like they had 300 people in there that were all just like newborn babies and they were chopping their heads off with hatchets or something like that. That was not what was happening. And that was part of the code of conduct that was revised. It's like they can only use anything like lethal force if at first they go through a series of processes, like using verbal commands first, and they have to really make sure that there is no imminent danger to the agents. I mean, that's what the things like the agents should only be doing. Federal agents should only be using like firearm force if there is an immediate danger to their life. But it's like that's still not going to change our broken system. I mean, when I said to try and get away from Iowa, it's like maybe some people are moving off the grid because they feel like they're going to be away from sort of the broken system of the world. That I can comprehend. The broken, corrupt cycle of the world. Oh, I can comprehend why people are going to be moving to places like northern Idaho, as well as other parts of rural America, to get away from some of that. I mean, they're kind of viewing that as just a solution because no matter what political dynamic we're going to have, it seems like these injustices still occur. And it seems like these corrupt practices still occur. And abuses of power. And just people who are trying to just take over another person's freedom and such. And even about just going about things in different ways. I mean, there were so many other possible alternatives than having an 11-day standoff that left multiple people dead because of a firearms charge that somebody was provoked and coerced and coaxed into doing. It's just like, we're just looking at how nasty our world is, and it's just like, well, let's just throw a dart at the dartboard of nastiness and let's see where it ends up. I mean, that's one of the reasons why some people like the Weaver family might move off the grid. One of the things about this, though, is, I mean, if we're going to talk about off the grid, like, I mentioned I'm from West Virginia, though. The only thing that's come out of this in a positive light for me is just Boundary County might be one of my next destinations. I mentioned a few things about, like, I wanted to go to certain parts of the country to research the true crime cases. I mean, after learning about Ruby Ridge, before, I mean, we've done it on the channel before, I really thought about, oh, I just got to go out there. I got to see northern Idaho for myself. All the turmoil aside in this, I mean, it just got me really fascinated with that part of the country. I've never been. Maybe do some sort of road trip. I mean, West Virginia to Boundary County, Idaho. That would probably be quite the drive. Definitely need someone to go with, and probably got to stock up on Cheetos for the ride, if you know what I mean. But it really seems like a fascinating part of the country that a lot of people probably haven't explored. So that's going to be something on the to-do list. Maybe write that down on the bucket list for the next coming years. But aside from that, it's like we got to look at something in our culture, in our society, and definitely in the practices of government about why these things are happening. I mean, I think it has something to do with kind of top-down leadership and kind of this whole sort of emperor-king dynamic that we've had for centuries in the European tradition, as well as other things like the chiefdom in the quote unquote New World, for lack of a better term, and the pharaohs. It's just the palace economy, things like that. We've had that sort of dynamic, and that leads to a lot of nasty things. That leads to a lot of the ways about how people fight to the top, and how people do corrupt practices. and we need to break that cycle. So things like Ruby Ridge don't happen. It's just that power dynamic about people are just trying to be more powerful than the other person. And when you do that, you lose human empathy. Absolutely. Because all you care about is your own power. All you care about is being the one who's giving the orders. All you care about is the one who's being the person who is demanding things. And I don't mean you specifically, I mean the government in this case. Once again, many agencies came together and many agencies were involved, and none of them were better than the others. How do we break this cycle? I don't have a perfect answer for that. I wish I did. What I can say is one of the possibilities about a new philosophy of leadership could be, instead of having this top-down thing that's kind of like somebody's at the top giving out orders and people have to follow and then people start kind of like toughening up, it's more like a leader needs to be at the center of communication, and then people on different sides are just, the leader is the person who has the most amount of information coming to him or her, and then this leader kind of makes decisions that can benefit all of these people. It's not top down. The leader is the center point. And that was actually the first TED talk I ever heard was on that exact subject. And is that a magic cure-all? It's like I don't really think we've ever had the United States of America function like that in our state and local government or in our federal government. I don't think we've ever had something like that where the leader is the kind of center point of communication. We still have that type of top-down dynamic, but I don't know. Maybe like if you just sort of think about how things go in your personal life, maybe at the office or with friendships and stuff, think about how that absorbing communication how can be beneficial to you. I mean, I think about it a lot. I don't know if it's perfectly aligned with leadership, but it's something to think about. It's just one of the ways that we got to look at. I mean, I want to hear some new ideas about how we can break the cycles of corruption in the United States of America. How do we get out of these kind of fractured practices where people are just caught up in the exercise of power? Because that's what happened at Ruby Ridge. It's not about morality. It's not even about the legal charges. It's not about anything other than people are just trying to force somebody else to do something. Waco, Texas might have been a little bit different, but that's a subject for another time. I mean, I only brought it up to say that Waco did not necessarily. Waco had more severe charges than Ruby Ridge did, and that's one of the reasons why the peace activists were outside of the home in Ruby Ridge, kind of demanding peace now and just like give peace a chance and all of those things. That's why you see some of those signs, because people from all backgrounds can just recognize the agents involved with this went too far. All right, well, that's all for me now. What do you have to say about the Ruby Ridge Massacre from 1992? What do you have to say about the Weaver family? If you have anything to say at all, I would love to hear from you. And until next time.